The Arctic system is now the epicenter of global climate change. It's a race against time to understand the implications and take action to reduce the negative consequences of climate change. Science now informs us about what we can expect and what we can do about it.
There's a lot of information feeding into our assessment of Arctic climate, and it's all pointing to a system that's really emerging out of the normality. The Arctic is heating up now 3 times faster than the world. 15 years ago, we were talking 2 times faster. Now we're at 3 times faster.
In 1991, AMAP started to monitor the Arctic environment with an ambition to understand and analyze the situation and to produce policy recommendation based on questions such as, what are the drivers of Arctic climate change? What will the consequences be? What policies can be implemented in time to create better life conditions for Arctic communities and beyond?
I believe that scientists will give us the possible outcomes for the future. They can predict what's going to happen, and they have predicted for a long time. I see that the older generation did not listen to the scientists as fast as they should have, and I believe that the young people can then listen and act to what the scientists are saying, because it will influence our future.
This knowledge now has deep relevance for the whole planet.
The fact that the Arctic is changing implies that the rest of the world is going to be undergoing changes in the future as well.
This is how far we are.
The problems we've worked on now for 30 years, they're still there. We have increased our understanding, we have improved our understanding, and we have also solved parts of them, but they're still there, and there are new problems.
Arctic warming has dramatically accelerated over the last 15 years. The speed of change is overwhelming, and this calls for timely action to inform decision-making, just as fast as the change is happening.
What we find is actually a coherent picture that the atmosphere is getting more humid. There's rainfall now more instead of snowfall. We see an acceleration of the loss of land ice, sea ice, snow cover. There's more water coming through the rivers. It's freshening up the oceans. And so altogether, we have a coherent signal that the Arctic is really responding to the global crisis of climate change.
We are observing in the Arctic, all Arctic ecosystems are greatly impacted by climate change, but local ecosystems are impacted by contaminants that shouldn't be there, that are coming from somewhere else. And all of these changes reverberate or resonate up into human societies. They affect our health, and they affect many of our societal functions.
Therefore, Arctic communities, ecosystems, and wildlife are affected by a complex range of changes.
The present state of the Arctic is one of compelling change. We're seeing this change not only in the average climate, temperature and precipitation, but also in the extremes. Changing extremes are one of the characteristics of a changing climate. We're also seeing new extremes in precipitation, flooding rains. There have been a number of occurrences of heavy rainfall events in the last few years that are very consistent with a changing climate, and those rainfall events have led to floods. We're seeing a dramatic loss of sea ice. Sea ice in the Arctic is down about 40% in the summertime. It's really an impressive change climatically. We're seeing warming ground temperatures, and that means that frozen ground, permafrost, is thawing. And that has consequences for the infrastructure that's on the ground. We're seeing changes in wildfire frequency. Severe wildfire years are becoming more frequent than they had been in the past. That's true both in North America and in Russia. We're also seeing changes in invasive species. Different types of animals are moving into habitats that they had not occupied previously. So there are a number of consequences. They're showing up on land and in the ocean.
Arctic change impacts the rest of the globe. The effects of Arctic change are felt far beyond the Arctic, including impacts of global sea level rise. Hence, understanding the Arctic's response to global emissions is crucial.
We're facing irreversible climate change. The Arctic normally has a thin cover of frozen seawater. In this reflective cover, it helps regulate the Arctic climate, and now is half as large as it was 50 years ago. We've effectively broken this reflector of the northern Arctic climate system. And we can't really put that mirror back together until we bring quite a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere.
Climate change will affect the Arctic over generations. It is particularly important to include young people living in the Arctic who will have to face the future consequences of policies being made today.
Scientists have said for a long time that we need to act more sustainably, and young people are starting to realize the urgency of this. If these two get together and the policymakers start to listen to this, we can then work for the most sustainable future.
However, there is also a less obvious connection between climate and pollutants that may affect health in the Arctic. The climate change may change how pollutants are transported to, stored, and taken up in food chains in the Arctic.
The persistent organic pollutants have been a major problem in the Arctic, especially as they cause human exposure. And we can see associations between climate parameters, for example, the extent of sea ice, and then the POP levels that we see in air and biota of the Arctic. And that also relates to mercury. When we detect a compound in the Arctic, we have indication of its persistence and long-range transport. When we detect it in Arctic food chains, we even have evidence of bioaccumulation. So these data are very helpful in assessing POP criteria. So the long time series we have in the Arctic document that the regulation has an effect.
While POPs and mercury have been studied by AMAP since the 1990s, effects of new chemicals of emerging Arctic concern are still to be better understood.
Our basic understanding of contaminants in the Arctic in a way hasn't changed very much in recent years. We've known for quite a while that we got contaminants from industrialized nations up to the Arctic, and we've known that it got into food webs. Where we're getting smarter now, or where we're understanding more, is how these are being transported into humans and the potential effects of these on humans, not least of which on the development of fetal brains.
We have improved our understanding of the pollution of the Arctic, but we have also identified new issues. At the beginning, we looked mainly at the mercury and the persistent organic pollutants, but they're still there in the Arctic, and mercury is still there, and new problems have emerged. For example, the chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, which are other chemicals we detect in the Arctic. There's also the emerging issue of microplastics, for example, that show up everywhere in the Arctic.
These new scientific findings will create the basis for a new understanding of how climate change affects exposure to contaminants and what this will mean for Arctic people. Important knowledge also for decisions about international regulations of chemical pollutants.
With all of this information coming together, it's like the policy should adapt to the science, because we have clear information about the Arctic affecting global climate. And so policy needs to listen to that science so that we can have the most effective and really cost-saving policies going forward.
The increase in human activity in the Arctic calls for joint efforts to develop science-based policy making for a sustainable Arctic future. It is a chance to create new, sustainable and scientifically sound policies through bodies such as the Arctic Council.
The next generation is going to face a lot of unexpected problems due to climate change. But changes can also bring possibilities, and for the Arctic, there's a lot of change right now. If we act the right way and take this change as a possibility, the future generation can work with this the best possible way.
AMAP will continue to address key knowledge gaps and deliver the information needed to support policy and decision-making also for future Arctic generations. AMAP's recommendations calls for action to avoid irreversible and even more widespread changes affecting the Arctic and beyond. They support the need to urgently reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and short-lived climate forces and fully implement the Paris Agreement. Eliminate or reduce contamination of the Arctic by hazardous chemical through appropriate actions at the national, regional or global level, including implementation of the Stockholm and Minamata Conventions. Continue extending the knowledge base on these topics and on the influence of climate change on pollutants and contaminants, and increase knowledge on the Arctic systems and its connections to the global systems.
I think one of the most important messages is that the knowledge that we have here gives us power. It gives us the power to change things. So there is hope. This isn't gloom and doom. This is our key to solving the challenges that we're facing in the Arctic and in the rest of the world.